Hey guys, today we're going to examine nationalist revolutions in Europe in the mid-1800s. Why is nationalism such a big deal though? Well, Europe prior to the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 was a continent with lots of multinational empires. Uh, France, Spain, Austria, every single one of them had some piece of Italy. Um, and then, Austria itself was a massive multinational empire. They controlled Hungary, they controlled Romania, Transylvania, pretty much the entire Balkan region. Um, and events like the French Revolution and Napoleon's efforts to conquer, like, all of that, um, well, that kind of spread nationalist ideas across Europe, made it a big deal. So we're going to start with Greece in the 1820s. The Greeks were controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but they wanted independence. Didn't want to be controlled by a foreign national power. And despite the fact that this war for independence kind of went against everything the Congress of Vienna and their Concert of Europe, all those efforts for stability in Europe, this war for independence goes against everything that was all about. But a lot of European countries are going to support the Greeks. But Mr. Cottrell, you hypothetical student ask, why would they do that? Why would they go against that whole, stability, concert of Europe thing? Well, Greece is kind of the birthplace of European culture and civilization. It's kind of an important deal, philosophy and art and education and knowledge and all that kind of jazz. It all kind of started over in Greece. And they didn't want to just let the Ottoman Turks, non-Europeans and Muslims to boot, rule over a group of Europeans. So the citizens and the militaries of places like Great Britain, Russia, France, all end up joining in the fight against the Ottoman Turks. They end up helping the Greeks fight their war for independence. Lots of private citizens, guys like the famous British poet Lord Byron, run off and go join the Greek resistance to fight against the Ottoman Turks. And in fact, the combined militaries of Great Britain, Russia, and France are all going to get together and fight against the Ottomans in the Battle of Navarino in 1827. That's kind of the big, important battle of the Greek Revolution. After that, the Ottomans kind of gave up, and Greece got its independence in 1830. So a lot of European countries are going to go through nationalist revolts in 1830. They're inspired by the French Revolution, by the Greek War for Independence. You're going to see it break out in places like Belgium, where they revolt against the Netherlands. Italy's going to revolt against Austria. Poland's going to revolt against Russia. Every single one of these revolts is going to fail. They're just not powerful enough. They're not strong enough to be able to fight back against some of the most powerful countries in Europe. They just can't. But even though the revolts fail, it's important to note that nationalism doesn't just go away because you lost a couple of battles. In fact, if anything, these nationalist revolts are going to strengthen the feelings of nationalism in a lot of these. What you're seeing is the strength of the Congress of Vienna, of that desire for stability and the status quo, of not changing anything in Europe. It's a very strong sentiment. Each country is kind of helping the others out to maintain that status quo, that balance of power that we talked about with the Congress of Vienna. It's still going on. They're still trying to keep it. But like I said, just because you put down a revolt or two, just because you lose a couple of battles, doesn't mean that that nationalist feeling is going to go away. Meanwhile, over in France, another revolution is happening, because if the French love anything, it's revolutions. The king at the time, Charles X, is trying to make France an absolute monarchy again, and the French people just aren't having it. So they run Charlie out of the country. He runs off and spends the rest of his life in England, and they replace him with a king named Louis Philippe. Now, at first, Louis Philippe is all about liberal reforms. Hey, let's, expand some voting rights and stuff like that. But by 1848, he's not all that popular in France either. The country was experiencing some problems, things weren't going as smoothly as they'd like, and so he gets overthrown. And France says, you know what? Let's try that whole republic thing again. And so they do. They become a republic again, and they elect. That can't be right. They elect a guy named Napoleon president? Yep, Louis Napoleon, nephew of our favorite French general slash emperor, the original Napoleon. He's actually pretty popular. Enough so that he gets himself. Wait, seriously? He declares himself emperor? Oh, come on, France, have some originality, for crying out loud. But yeah, he starts calling himself Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. French people totally support him, totally love an Emperor Napoleon, as it turns out. Uh, and he did it all with the popular support of the people. Like, he revitalized the economy, he improved their infrastructure, rebuilt a bunch of the roads. But, maybe it wasn't all bad in Europe. I mean, let's talk a little bit about Russia. Russia's a very different place, right? Specifically, let's talk about Tsar Alexander II, who was a pretty good guy. He tried to make some major changes in Russia, tried to do some good things. Of course, he ends up getting assassinated for his troubles. Um, he did have some radical reforms that he tried, such as abolishing serfdom in 1861, getting rid of the whole medieval idea of everybody, is bonded to the land and doesn't really have any individual rights. And then he just gives all these new peasants a little plot of land, all their own, to farm. Um, of course, they have a bunch of taxes they have to pay now, which they didn't have to pay before when they were serfs. And in fact, the tax burden is so heavy they actually can't afford to pay it and end up indebted to the landowners, having to sell their piece of land to the nobles. It's a pretty terrible situation actually for the peasants, the former serfs, to be in. And so it's not really a surprise that when Alexander II gets assassinated in 1881, his son Alexander III ends up rolling back pretty much every single one of the reforms that Alex II had put through. Now, while we're in Russia, we should probably mention Russification. It's a form of assimilation, making all of the different ethnic and nationalist groups that lived within that huge Russian empire all adopt Russian culture and language. And the idea, of course, is that if they're all using the same language, all following the same culture, that they're less likely to want to have a violent revolution and more likely to feel a sense of unity and like togetherness. But it backfires. A lot of these little smaller groups in Russia really don't care for this idea at all. And in fact, they become very resentful, and it inspires a bunch of nationalist feelings. So, good job, Russia. So, last but not least, we need to talk a little bit about the Austrian Empire. It is one of the biggest multinational empires in all of Europe in the 1800s. And in 1848, there's a big nationalist revolt in Hungary, which is part of the Austrian Empire. There's a Hungarian nationalist named Louis Kossuth who demands that Hungary get its own national parliament and self-government. The Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, the man who orchestrated the Concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna, is actually so disgraced by what occurs in this revolt that he's forced to resign his position as foreign minister of Austria. And the Austrian emperor agrees to dissolve the Austrian Empire and create what we call the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. It's a really unique situation. They've got two separate governments, one for Austria and one for Hungary, with their own parliaments and their own laws and everything. But each one of them has the same king. It's one king, two countries. The same king rules both countries. They're just kind of separate, but not separate. It's very strange, and I don't know of any other place where it's ever really happened quite like that. Right, so that's nationalism. I mean, as we can see, it's a unifying force in some cases, it's a dividing force in a lot of others. We'll look at a couple of examples later on in the unit, Germany and Italy specifically, where we'll see it really unify and bring people together. For now, though, we just want to make sure that we know that nationalism was a very strong, very powerful force in in Europe at the time, and it's going to remain very powerful in Europe until World War II at least. So there we go.